Hello, my name is Parinita Shetty, and in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the research and personal challenges that I encountered during my PhD fieldwork and what I've managed to learn while navigating them. A super brief introduction to my PhD project. I'm looking at how fan podcasts, that is, podcasts which are made by people about their favorite books, movies, and TV shows, act as alternative sites of education and politicization. As a part of the data creation process, I started a fan podcast called Marginally Fanish. My co participants and I discussed how mainstream science fiction and fantasy media stereotypes and erases diverse groups of people. While introducing their framework of a methodology of discomfort, Jake Burdick and Jennifer A. Sandlin ask researchers to embrace and write about their feelings of unease and uncertainty in order to challenge notions of what is acceptable in research. Inspired by their invitation, this presentation attempts to show how my discomfort provided me the opportunity to learn from a lot of different sources. I'll begin with some research challenges. When I designed my project and its methodology, I wanted to keep the format as participatory as possible. Before recording our episodes, my co participants and I exchanged fan texts about the theme of the episode and used them as discussion prompts so that we could have a more informal two-way conversation. I wanted conversations rather than interviews so that my questions didn't control the direction of our episode. One pitfall of this method was that I had to deal with my own biases and blind spots as I interacted with people from diverse identities. With a few participants, I ended up making assumptions about what topic they'd be interested in based on my own limited understanding of their background. In episode 8 with Hibiki, a fan from Japan, I recommended texts which explored Japanese media like anime and Pokemon, or which explored Asian American perspectives. I didn't critically analyze my choices until much later. At the time, I thought that these texts would make Hibiki comfortable since they reflected his country of origin. What I didn't think about was that he might be completely unfamiliar with the Japanese media that I'd suggested. In fact, his recommendations were three movies that he really loved, which explored issues of race in different ways, all of which were produced in the US or the UK. In hindsight, it's really absurd that I didn't consider this since I grew up in India watching primarily Western movies myself. In the case of Aisha in episode 18, we decided to focus on diverse cultures within the Harry Potter books. Based on this, I chose texts which drew parallels between religion, Islam, and Harry Potter in different ways. Since Aisha is a Muslim fan from Dubai, I thought these themes might resonate with her. She loved a couple of the texts that I recommended. But she clarified that while she didn't mind discussing her Muslim identity during our conversation, she'd prefer that religion is not a focus because she didn't connect her religious experiences with her fan identity. She was more confident talking about Japanese anime and culture, ironically enough. In both cases, I inadvertently conflated their interests with their identities. In future, I would adjust my research design so that my co-participants and I can understand each other's perspectives and interests before we recommend texts. Another drawback was that since it was a conversation rather than an interview, I inadvertently derailed some of my co-participants' perspectives or accidentally monopolized the conversation. In episode 3, Anna began to discuss how modern Wicca tries to be more inclusive of different identities. I disrupted her point by bringing up how there can be exclusions even within pagan and political movements today. I didn't notice a problem with my inputs while we were chatting. However, in hindsight, I realized that rather than actively listening to Anna's point and exploring the discussion that she raised, I crowbarred my own disputes in. While I do think that interesting conversations can emerge through conflicting viewpoints, It would have been more interesting to explore the political and environmental aspects of paganism, something that I was really ignorant of and Anna had more expertise with. When I published episode 16, I received an extremely polite email from someone who had read the transcript of the episode and critiqued an aspect of my role in it. The person analyzed the transcript and found that while I had spoken for a total of 5,905 words, my co participant Tam spoke for a total of 2,298 words. I was initially really embarrassed by this email, but I genuinely appreciated the thoughtful feedback. Thinking about the critique and writing a response to the email not only allowed me to consider the limitations of my method, but also potential solutions. The lack of specific interview questions meant that co participants were free to share as much or as little as they wanted, and it also meant that some were chattier than others. I wasn't sure how comfortable Tam was with sharing their lived experiences on the episode, and I really didn't want to push them into saying anything they hadn't brought up of their own accord. At the same time, I have the tendency to talk a lot and rush to interrupt in bursts of enthusiasm or to fill in silences, something that I still struggle to find a balance for. This is especially problematic in instances like episode 16, where, as a cisgender woman talking to a non binary person, I ended up talking over someone from a marginalized group. People also have different communication styles. For some, interruptions are really rude, whereas for me, interruptions are a form of active listening where I'm demonstrating that I'm paying attention. The email critique made me want to take more concrete measures to find a way to manage this so that different personalities and communication styles don't hamper the conversation. While planning some episodes, my co participants and I decided to divide segments amongst ourselves so that each of us was in charge of facilitating a certain part of the conversation. This allowed us a chance to share our opinions and perspectives about different topics. For future episodes, this might be a good plan for all co participants. Dividing segments in this way would hopefully allow more reticent participants a chance to talk more and help me make room for silences. Silences can be a really important part of the thinking process for many people, and I'd like to learn how to grow more comfortable with them. As I reflected on different parts of my data creation and analysis stages, I realized that while I'm proud of many aspects of my project, I'm less proud of the mistakes. However, these mistakes resulted in a different kind of pedagogy. For me, the podcast project was an active learning process in different ways, both the creation of the episodes as well as the conversations that they allowed me to have. According to the methodology of discomfort, imperfection is a crucial part of our knowledge making process. Growing comfortable with being uncomfortable is a great way to learn what we don't know. As a researcher, this uncertainty and constant reflexivity helped me identify gaps in my research design. My mistakes helped me question my assumptions, reflect on my limitations, learn from new perspectives, and imagine new possibilities. However, these research lessons couldn't really help me with my personal challenges. 2020 was an immensely difficult period for me, thanks to a combination of pandemic, social, political, and mental health problems. Beginning in December 2019, J.K. Rowling's tweets caused a furor among a portion of the Harry Potter fandom for allegedly being transphobic. The Harry Potter books and participation in its fandom are inextricably tied to my sense of self. For me, Harry Potter has always gone side by side with its fandom. I've learned so much from fanish conversations and critiques, which have made my own politics and ideas about equality, oppression, and privilege more inclusive. The books provided me with hope and comfort during a really troubled childhood and during a difficult 2020. So, I've struggled with these revelations and their implications for being able to continue loving Harry Potter. Throughout the pandemic, I used the podcast as a coping mechanism to be able to deal with my depression and anxiety, which stemmed from many different sources. As the quarantine took a toll on my mental health, I became socially disconnected from everybody but still worked furiously on the podcast. However, in June 2020, it became impossible for me to carry on as usual. J.K. Rowling's tweets, the video of George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter protests in the US and across the world, examples of police brutality, the lockdown related migrant crisis in India, India's ongoing descent into fascism, the hateful rhetoric online, the complete lack of empathy, and the abundance of racism and xenophobia, all of it became too much. I was supposed to record episode 13 of the podcast in June, an episode which looked at the ways in which fascist governments weaponized religion and geographic origin through media propaganda. But the research for the episode and the events of the month ended up depressing me so much that I had to ask my co host to postpone it. Since I started working on this podcast in December 2019, every month there have been several news events which have contributed to the overall, as John and Hank Green would call it, world suck. I'm usually a really optimistic person, but I found myself growing increasingly despondent and angry about everything that was going on. Of course, this came from a place of immense privilege that I'm encountering the injustices secondhand rather than facing them directly. So add some massive survivor's guilt into the mix, something which has become relevant again as India is currently imploding during its second wave of the pandemic. June 2020 finally made me wonder. The world is on fire, so what's the point? What's the point of a fan podcast where we're talking about cultural representations and marginalized perspectives in media? What's even the point of doing a PhD? Then, that weekend, a newsletter that I subscribed to online included this image. The function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It's to imagine what is possible. Bell hooks. Phantom discussions about how media represents different marginalized groups of people can act as valuable eye openers about their real world experiences and oppressions. Media representations influence mainstream culture, which in turn influences mainstream politics. In her book, Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit reminds us that even in the midst of struggles for a better world, it's really important to celebrate the changes which we have witnessed as a result of past activist work in different social, cultural, and political contexts. She says, uprisings and revolutions are often considered to be spontaneous, but less visible long term organizing and groundwork, or underground work, often laid the foundation. Changes in ideas and values also result from work done by writers, scholars, public intellectuals, social activists, and participants in social media. It seems insignificant or peripheral until very different outcomes emerge from transformed assumptions about who and what matters, who should be heard and believed, who has rights. Ideas at first considered outrageous or ridiculous or extreme gradually become what people think they've always believed. How the transformation happened is rarely remembered, in part because it's compromising. It recalls the mainstream when the mainstream was, say, rabidly homophobic or racist in a way it no longer is. And it recalls that power comes from the shadows and the margins, that our hope is in the dark around the edges, not in the limelight of center stage. Our hope and often our power. Unquote. This idea allowed and continues to allow me to work on my research in the hope that even if it contributes the tiniest bit to a shift in the conversation, I can feel like I've done something. Popular culture shapes people's imaginations in ways which can both limit or expand them. Conversations on marginally Fanish enabled a collective process of decolonization as we navigated patterns of erasure and dominance in our favorite media. Such interactions challenged the single stories promoted by mainstream media, structural inequalities, and representational inadequacies. Ideas which promote radical inclusivity, empathy, and respect for diverse experiences, don't just materialize out of thin air. Encountering conversations which imagine a more equal and just world than the one we currently inhabit can reshape the architecture of our imaginations. Thank you. If you'd like to chat, please feel free to get in touch. You'll find me hanging out in different places online.